Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Screen. I'm going to take this out. I don't need to be listening to anything while I'm doing this. Good morning, Grom. Good to see you. Good to see you, Bob. We were just talking a little Elden Ring before we got started here to Behind the Screen. Welcome to everyone on Thursday morning. I am JM. This is the Iconic Production channel. Here we talk about, on Behind the Screen, we talk about game design, encounter design, game reviews. We talk about what gaming is like, and we just try and make our games better. We do campaign clinics. We just talk about gaming. It's the thing that I love to talk about, and I'm so glad that you guys are all here with me. Today we are continuing the second part of our three-part look at high fantasy and what makes it different from other genres. And today we're going to look at the mechanical reinforcements that games and game masters should be looking at when they want their game to evoke a high fantasy feel. So we talked a lot about last time what makes something high fantasy as opposed to, say, epic fantasy, or as we're going to talk about low fantasy, your sword and sorcery, that sort of thing. Hey, Padre, good morning to you as well. And really the big difference is the presence of magic. Rook, thank you, sir, and thank you to Zero Earth Element, and I'm going to butcher this, Dinerborn. Welcome. So, the main thing is the presence of magic. Epic fantasy and low fantasy as sort of have lower and more mysterious magic. It is a presence in the world, but it's not always present in the party. It's not always replicable. It's not always, again, more mysterious. However, and in Sword and Sorcery, magic tends to be in the providence only of the evil rulers of the world, right? So you take a look at Conan, right? Thulsa Doom and the Empire of Set. Those are really where you see the most magic. Conan doesn't have magic. Conan fights against... Hey, I did! Yes! Thanks, Rook. Against those who have magic, or magic is something mysterious or evil or other that worldly that destroys, controls, enslaves, that sort of thing. In high magic, it is prevalent, and it is, when done well, is written across every character, across every landscape, across every story that we see in the game. So, when we're talking about mechanical considerations, what does that mean for us? Like, what games should we be looking at? What things should we be looking at mechanically for a good high fantasy game? And what should we be trying to bring to the fore? On Tuesday, we're going to talk about how do we replicate the high fantasy experience for our players. So today we're talking about the mechanics. Oh, hey, Rook, as always, thank you, sir. Cheers, my friend. You are aces in our book. So, all right. Mechanical considerations and what systems do this well. Well, we talked about there have to be a lot of monsters, and the monsters have to be wild and they have to be fantastical. We don't want just, so for example, I'm going to look at Jackals right now. Jackals is not a high fantasy setting. Jackals only has about a dozen, maybe 20 monsters. Most of the threats that you fight are other humans. It's a very sword and sorcery kind of feel to it. D20 games, especially modern ones. I think 5e does this really well. Pathfinder 1 and 2 do this really well. Savage Worlds does this really well. RuneQuest does this really well. 13th Age does this really well. You get the bizarro, crazy monsters. We don't just get orcs and goblins. We have those, and spiders and trolls. We have that in Middle Earth. We get owlbears, beholders, illithids. We get behemoths. A new book coming out for 13th Age is Paths of the Behemoths, and it's going to be great. Ben Feehan, who's often in the chat and plays Kowalski on our FET 5 game, wrote a chapter for behemoths, as did Becca. these giant monstrosities that just roam the land in this massive path. They're like natural features, not monsters that you fight. Gibbering mouthers. Yeah, put your favorite high fantasy monster in, like, the weirder, the better. Cloakers, aboleths. I mean, I could just go on. These are the things that make these settings far more high fantasy than epic fantasy, especially as they became more and more prevalent late 2E, 3E, 4E, 5E. Warhammer has a ton of weird monsters as well, and there are moments where I think Warhammer steps into the high fantasy arena, because that's the next thing we're going to talk about. You know what? You need lots of magic. And specifically, you want a lot of different types of magic. So if we go back to our exemplars of the genre, Malazan, there are more Warrens than I could possibly name. There are Elderholds, there are Ascendants. In Raymond Feist's, you have the magic users of the high and the low path. You have in D&D, and in D20 Fantasy, you have wizards, you have clerics, you have bards, you have sorcerers, you have monks that have magical abilities, you have paladins, you have druids. In RuneQuest, because I would argue that RuneQuest, when set in Glorantha, has this high fantasy feel to it, right? And at first I was like, my brain was like, I was writing down like, oh, RuneQuest hits all of these markers. And I was like, no, it doesn't. RuneQuest is Bronze Age, it's low fantasy. Yet you travel to different planes of existence. You have magical items that get imbued. Everyone has magic in that system. Everyone has access to spirit magic and rune magic for their cults. The gods are real. They step down. You have the fact that the mountains are just giants who grew too large, or sleeping dragons. That's high fantasy. Yes, metallic dragons and gem dragons as well, which are just amazing. Then you get into, like, towards the end of Pathfinder 1's existence, where you got like the elemental dragons and the apocalyptic dragons. Those were intense. Another great book, if you're trying to add a high fantastical feel, is Kobold Press's Tome of Beasts 1 and 2 for 5th edition. That just adds just a plethora of new, strange things. But they're all tied back to magic, right? You have aberrations come from the Far Realm. My brain just died a little bit. You have psionics. You have, well, both good, evil, and psionics. Yeah, exactly. So you want a lot of different magic systems. So games that can replicate that are really good for us, right? We've established that D20 kind of has this baked in. We started, I argue that old school D&D leans much more toward the epic fantasy genre, whereas new school D&D very much leans into the high fantasy genre, right? Especially 4th edition. Like 4th edition was super heroic high fantasy. But 5th edition, as Rook and I were talking about a little bit on the Discord, somewhere between 8 and 10, you move out of that kind of epic feel into the fantastical feel. Yep, and there's even more dragons. And right, dragons are a thing that we love in our high fantasy. And not just, here's an interesting one for Bob. The difference between epic and high fantasy could also be looked at as by the dragon. Dragons in epic fantasy are creatures of chaos, right? They are greedy, they may be very intelligent, but they are rare, they are greedy, and they represent chaos that breaks down civilization, which is why heroes go out to stop them. And there's not a lot of them. In high fantasies, there's just dragons all over the place, right? Court of Worms was an entire 2E box set on playing dragons. In 5th edition and modern D&D, we have at least 3 genres of dragons, if not multiple versions of dragons. You have courts of dragons, you have dragon gods, you have the machinations of dragons. They shapeshift. A good example of how to use high fantasy dragons would be in the first season of Critical Role, or the first season of the Critical Role animated show on Amazon. Dragons there feel more high fantastical. They are not just a creature of chaos. They are a sentient creature that is There are multiple of them. They war with each other. They have this depth, and they cause wonder at really how are we supposed to compete with that. And when a hero brings a dragon down, it is a thing of legend. So Savage Worlds does a great job with providing you with multiple types of not just creatures, but ways to build magic systems. Just take a look at Deadlands, and I realize Deadlands is in no way high fantasy. The fantasy companion is coming out for Savage Worlds. We just got the update to the alpha. But when you look at Savage Worlds, what you see is, in Deadlands, they realize that there have to be multiple sources of magical power. So we have Harrowed, we have Hucksters, we have Blessed, we have Keymasters, we have Shamans, and they all work a little differently. That's something you want mechanically in a good high fantasy game. Yes, Padre, agreed. They are evil. They're servants of Morgoth, but they also and Morgoth being sort of the chaos, the evil. And when I say chaos, I don't mean like disorder. I mean this in like the old Semitic sense of the world, the dissolution of reality. You always find dragons out on the edge. They have destroyed order and then turned that destruction into their horde. And that is in some way sustaining to them. When you slay the dragon, order is allowed to then retake that area, right? But the fall of Gondolin is because of a dragon. Or is it Nargothrond? Somebody will have to confirm that for me. I'm thinking of the story of the Children of Hurin specifically. Glaurung destroys Nargothrond, I believe. So chaos. So I will defer to, and again, this is why I think RuneQuest or Glorantha really leans into almost a high magical feel, because they separate chaos as dissolution, or the dissolution not just of order but of self, and entropy, disorder. Another great high fantasy setting, which I don't think people talk nearly enough about, is Exalted. Exalted is high fantasy, but not from a Western sort of point of view, more of a Semitic Eastern point of view. That game is all about the high fantasy experience. Big weapons, big people, big power. But again, the thing is, high fantasy doesn't have to be about the power creep. It's really about the character's interaction with a world of wonder and magic. And magic is everywhere. And magic is so diverse in a high fantasy game that you can go from floating cities to dragon ruins in the depths of the ocean, to stepping into the plane of fire, to going to the city of doors, right? There is a... yes, I would agree, Grom. It is for people who think that 20th level D&D is just not strong enough, and I would like to start a game stronger. Another thing that you have in there that is great is you want a lot of magical items. You don't just want magic to be within the characters and without the characters. Magical artifacts tend to be the goal, the thing that characters go out and quest for. So you want a lot of magic items. I will say this is, in my mind, one of the places that 5th edition fails a little bit. I understand it was a design choice, but it fails the high fantasy test with the attunement mechanic. Oh, that's pretty cool, Padre. One of your GMs ran a game of World of Darkness that you found out started as Exalted. That's pretty slick. I think that was always my problem with... We could do a whole debate on so JM, myself, I have ranked each version of the World of Darkness games on did I like old World of Darkness better or new World of Darkness better. I prefer new World of Darkness Hunter, the Vigil, as opposed to Hunter the Reckoning, because again, trying to bring very depowered, Exalted style characters into the World of Darkness just never fit for me. So what games do this well? We've talked a lot about them. We've mentioned modern D20 games. 13th Age, Pathfinder 1 and 2, D&D basically 3.5 on. They have all of this baked in. They kind of set the bar for gaming. Right? There's a reason that they're lingua franca of fantasy gaming, because if it has been done, D&D probably did it. Glorantha, RuneQuest, right? I just went over the fact that everyone has magic in that game. Spirit magic is ubiquitous. You also have great magic items. You have the ability to hero quest to travel into multiple different layers of reality. Remember, planar travel is something that we saw in the exemplars of this fiction, which again, D20 has the wheel, the Great Wheel. It's got sigil or sigil, depending on how you pronounce it. The City of Doors. You have the planes of fire, elemental planes, the positive and negative plane. Which, if you don't know, one of my favorite things about second edition D&D was the fact that if you go into the positive energy plane, you start gaining hit points, and not only do you gain hit points, but you gain temporary hit points until you reach twice your normal hit points in temporary hit points, and then you explode because you've taken in too much life. So the positive energy plane is as deadly to human life as the negative energy plane. Sort of like the Cancerverse in Marvel Comics. So what other game systems do this well? Well, we mentioned Savage Worlds, because you can ramp Savage up pretty much as high as you want. In Torg, Isle has a very high fantasy feel. I realize we talked about Star Wars a bit. The Knights of the Old Republic era, both with the D20 game and the West End game setting books, kind of help with that. Riffs from Palladium or Palladium Fantasy, I would actually argue that Palladium Fantasy does not qualify, pass our litmus test for high fantasy. It's probably more epic fantasy, but Rifts is definitely high fantasy. Any game where a wizard can go toe-to-toe with a giant robot is probably high fantasy. So you get this feel of, again, magic and wonder. But wonder, remember, wonder and awe does not have to be beauty. It can also be like awful comes from awe, right? Cosmic horrors, creatures created by magic that inspire terror. These are things we also see in the D20 fiction. We see this in, we see this in the fiction. We see this in D20 games. We see this in RuneQuest. Padre, I believe it was Padre who mentioned Warhammer. I would actually argue that the best example in the Warhammer oeuvre of high fantasy is the new Age of Sigmar setting. It is so unbelievably steeped in wonder and magic that it almost is hard to stare at for me. But you have the Fire Slayers who hammer runes into their flesh from the bones of their dead gods. You travel between realms, wielding magical artifacts. The Stormcasts can't die because their souls keep getting reforged by their god. I feel like these are all rule sets that really grasp what it means to be a high fantasy game. So, to review, things that are important to high fantasy from the fiction: lots of monsters, lots of magic, sense of wonder, multiple species, planar travel. So we had five key points. The games that we're talking about that mechanically kind of reinforce those 5 points are modern D20 games. If you're playing 5e, if you're playing Pathfinder, if you're playing 13th Age, you can lean into the high fantasy trope very easily. It may actually be harder for you to lean into the epic fantasy tropes with those games. Glorantha, especially like 13th Age Glorantha, but like I think even RuneQuest, even though you can die super easily, it doesn't, just because it's an epic or a high fantasy game doesn't mean that that people don't die. Again, look at Malazan Books of the Fallen. But RuneQuest hits all of those things: planar travel, multiple monsters, senses of wonder and awe, multiple magic systems, multiple magic items, that kind of thing. Age of Sigmar is another great one right out of the box that you can just get into and start running a high fantasy game. And the last one I would actually argue is I actually don't think, we talked about epic fantasy, I don't think generic systems typically do high fantasy well. Mainly because the GM is going to have to, out of the box. I realize if you're running a high fantasy GURPS game or Champions game, you're probably going to have to. Somebody may argue with me, although I don't know that we have that many GURPS or Champions or Hero System fans here. But the problem with those systems is it tends to lean into the fact that high fantasy just means more build points. I think high fantasy is a tough genre to emulate with a generic system. But Savage Worlds can get the job done. And Exalted. The fact that Exalted just was built from the ground up to be mythic and wonderful and awe-inspiring really, I think, helps us get that feel of high fantasy. So, any other systems that you guys in the chat would think, or anybody who is watching this later on YouTube, if you can think of other systems or settings that you say, hey, this is high fantasy, this is what it means for me, I would love to hear that. Yeah, Padre, you got that. So it's interesting. Maybe we'll have to do a whole discussion on Warhammer and Chaos, because Michael Moorcock, which is the root of kind of the Warhammer view of Chaos, steps away from kind of the old view of Chaos as dissolution. And Moorcock gives us this balance of chaos and order, like pure, unadulterated change versus static order. And the Warhammer guys really leaned more into Moorcockian metaphysics than they did into kind of traditional metaphysics. And then they kind of became their own thing, right? Much as I refer to modern game D20 games as Gygaxian fantasy, as its own sort of subgenre, Warcraft has become its own self-sustaining, self-referencing thing. Hey, John Doom, good to see you. Yes, I would actually argue that while I love the plethora of setting material in the Palladium world for Rifts, mechanically Savage Rifts is a much better system and reinforces the themes and the tropes behind it way better than the Palladium system did. And I mean, I say that with nothing but love for the Palladium system. I ran it for 15 years. But even now when I want to go back and look at running a Rifts game, when I get nostalgic for it, I just have to open my Rifts book. And that basically ends that nostalgia trip unless I bust open my Savage Rifts books. So that brings us to an end for our mechanical considerations and our system considerations. On Tuesday, we're going to wrap up the High Fantasy series and talk about how to really get that experience at the table. And what's going to be really, what we're going to talk about is how to get a high fantasy system or high fantasy feel without creeping into Monty Hall or power gaming. Because again, I think at the base of it, high fantasy looks at magic and wants to say, look at this wonderful tapestry of magical things. You want to see it all, not you want to kill it all. So that brings us, yeah, I agree, John. I still think the mechanics for Palladium system works well for Palladium fantasy. And Heroes Unlimited through Revised, not through 2nd edition. But I feel like the joy for me in Rifts has always been the setting and not the system. I really need to get Savage Rifts to the table more often. I've tried it a couple of times with some one-shots, and yeah. So, thank you all for tuning in for this episode of Behind the Screen. It's always good to see everybody. Rook, as always, thank you for your generosity. We will be back on Tuesday with more Behind the Screen. We're going to wrap up High Fantasy. We'll probably do a review of Blackbirds on Thursday just for Bob so we can see how beautiful the book is and probably run out and buy it. We will be back on Saturday with Exploring Glorantha at 10 a.m. where we're going to be talking about Tarsh, and we will be back on Monday with more Deadlands. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. We will see you all in well, Saturday or and Sunday we have our first look at Night's Black Agents, vampires versus spies in the Gumshoe system. So thank you all. Thank you, Padre. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Rook and Grom and John. And if I missed anybody, I do apologize. I will see you all sometime later this weekend, and I will definitely see you back here for more Behind the Screen. Hey, JD, good morning on Tuesday. Have a good one.